Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My presentation is on counseling persons with disabilities. I hope you like it and learn something from it. Let's go ahead and get started. So for our outline, we will begin with our pretest, get into the background regarding persons with disabilities. We'll talk about artifacts associated with that culture. There'll be some important information helpful to counselors that may be counseling people with disabilities. Case study, take our post test, and then we'll end with 5 ways to empower a person with a disability. So let's begin our pre-test. This might be a good place for you to pause the recording and to take a look at these questions and jot down your answers, and we will review them at the end of the presentation. So feel free to press pause, write your answers down, and then continue when you're finished. The first thing that we'll take a look at will be some statistical information, mostly about people with disabilities living in the United States. Currently, in the US, there are roughly 61 million adults living with a disability. The disabilities are broken out into different subcategories. So looking over here at this chart, the largest category of disabilities are considered mobile or mobility. So basically, this is serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs, kind of how it's treated. And that can take into consideration lots of different disabilities that will prevent people from doing that. The second largest type of disability is related to cognition. So that has serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. The third functional disability type is labeled as independent living. And these are adults with disabilities that have difficulty doing errands alone. So the type of things that we might take for granted in our day-to-day life, things like gas, going to the bank or the grocery store, things that make us independent are not a reality for people with disabilities. The next disability would be hearing. People with partial or full hearing loss in one or both ears, leaving them unable to hear and speak effectively with others. Of course, we have vision, where people are partially or fully blind in one or both eyes. And then the last functional disability type has to do with self-care. And those are individuals that have difficulty cleaning or bathing themselves. So you can see this is kind of how we think about the disabilities, but about 26% of the adult population in the US has a disability. So it's definitely a large part of our country. Disability in communities. In a few other slides, we're going to look at disabilities within race, but these ones here are pretty interesting. Thinking of our older adults, age 65 or older, 2 in 5 of our seniors have a disability. 1 in 4 women have a disability. 2 out of 5 non-Hispanic American Indians or Alaska Natives have a disability. This next graphic over here, disability and health, is really significant. When you stop and look at adults with disabilities are more likely to be obese, to smoke, and consequently have heart disease and diabetes. And if you look at the percentages and compare the two, you'll see that they are very drastic. and not in favor of adults with disabilities. So, makes having a disability even harder, complicated by these things. Another important factor would be access to health care. 1 in 3 adults with a disability do not have a usual health care provider. So, not a family doctor or a primary care physician that maybe has been with you most of your life, that knows your history, that kind of knows your health holistically. 1 in 3 do not have that benefit. 1 in 3 have unmet healthcare needs because of cost. As you might imagine, having a disability can really come with a financial strain and more frequent doctor's visits, emergency room visits, medications, not to mention, you know, equipment, wheelchairs, canes, special technology, all cause a financial burden and prevent people from getting the type of health care that they need. And 1 in 4 have just not had a routine checkup, which is unfortunate with someone with a disability. So with all of that said, it probably wouldn't surprise you to hear that adults with disabilities report mental distress almost 5 times as often as adults without disabilities. And studies have found that adults with disabilities are more likely to have other health concerns related to frequent mental stress than adults without disabilities. And we talked about that a little bit on the previous slide, but it probably wouldn't surprise that addition to having the disability could be a causal factor for depression. Not always. And we talk a little bit, actually, you'll hear it in a video later on in the presentation, that sometimes depression is a direct result of a disability, and sometimes it's not. It's important to make sure you're addressing it properly. I thought this was really interesting. So we looked at the United States as a whole, but this information I'm getting from the CDC website allows you to drill down by state. So I took a look at the state of Ohio, and over 2.25 million adults in Ohio have a disability. So about 1 in 4, or 25%, almost mirroring the national average. Looking at the types of disabilities at the top graphic here, the same 6 as we looked at from the national slide. Again, Ohio mirrors the national statistics of disabilities. Nothing unusual there. But what is very concerning on this bottom graphic, adults with disability, if you look where it says have depression, adults with disabilities are about 3.5 times more likely to experience depression than adults without a disability. So again, that probably doesn't surprise you, but the high score, I mean, it's almost, I don't know, it almost seems like it's a given. So then again, the obesity, smoking, diabetes, and heart disease, none of this bodes well for adults with disabilities. They're at a higher risk simply because of their disability. So definitely something that we as counselors need be aware of. This next graphic is also from the CDC, and it is regarding disability within different types of races. So you'll see there's white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native Hawaiian, and American Indian, and other multi races. And without getting too deep into the numbers, what this is really showing us is that minority or people of color, that particular population has a higher likelihood of persons with disabilities. And so it's not impossible or implausible that we would counsel someone with a disability that is in a minority group. And that has to be looked at holistically, and we'll talk more about that. But a minority person with a disability is going to have different experiences than a white person with a disability. And that all kind of falls to some of that social disability model that we're going to talk about here in the very near. Here it is for veterans. Basically, this is saying that if you were a veteran, you have a higher likelihood of having a disability. So important demographic groups and all impacted disabilities. In case you were wondering, the state of Ohio spends about $35 million a year, or about 37% of the state's healthcare spending in support of people with disabilities. So that's a big number, and quite frankly, I'm glad to hear that. That averages out to be about $17,732 per with a disability. So moving on to artifacts. This one was a little challenging, simply because regardless of how I did a Google search on artifacts for persons with disability, 9 times out of 10, the image I got back were what you're looking at right now. So a lot of these handicapped, faceless silhouettes. And not that there's anything wrong with these, and they certainly have their place, and they communicate certain things that are needed. However, it occurred to me, looking at these, of course, these are all faceless, and if your only experience with a disability is just seeing these signs, you don't know anybody, you're you're not getting the full story. And the fact that they're faceless got me thinking, and I'm like, man, it doesn't represent, and it's probably that was not its intent. But the way that I kind of like to think about it is I went out and I started looking for faces that I want to think that I would like to be my artifacts when I think of people with disabilities. And I like these pictures because that's silhouette or stick figure doesn't tell the story of the swimmer over here that doesn't have full limbs but swims, or the wheelchair racer, or any number of the athletes, or the gentleman working with a prosthetic leg. So this is the face of people with disabilities, and they're, as you can see here, strong and vibrant. They aspire just like any person. So I think it's important. I think this gets lost in those artifacts. And I know it's not intentional, but if it's your only exposure to disability, then you're missing out on these amazing stories. So what do counselors need to know? Well, there's a lot of good information. Fortunately, persons with disabilities have been at the center of a lot of discussion in our country and certainly in our legal system. So you may have already heard of or be familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. It became a law in 1990, civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, important areas, school, transportation, all public and private places that are open to the general public. And the reason we have it is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. You guys, it's really important that we as counselors understand this, because if our clients are experiencing any type of discrimination in any of these areas, hopefully they are well aware of the ADA, But if they're not, we should. And we should know that our government and our laws have a lot to say about this topic, and thankfully do. The next thing that counselors ought to be aware of are the models of disability. And this is, you can think of these as maybe three lens or three perspectives on how persons with disabilities are typically viewed. And a person can experience any one or combination of all of these views. But the first one is social. And it's not an individual issue, but it's social and cultural, with emphasis directed towards barriers, obstacles in the person's environment. So we as a society have work to do to make sure that we are operating in all of our systems with a mindset of inclusiveness for people with disabilities. But a lot of times, um, they are the object of discrimination and marginalization and are treated as a minority. From a moral perspective, the moral perspective interprets these physical differences as evidence of some kind of moral punishment, or it's a test of fate. So individuals or family members might respond to the existence of a disability with feelings of shame or even personal responsibility, which might be hard to hear or even believe, but it is true. This is part of their culture they deal with on a regular basis. The last perspective is medical. This approaches the medical approaches the disability within the traditional doctor-patient context as personal biomedical conditions to be diagnosed and treated. And while it's certainly a very important part of it, a lot of times, and hopefully unintentionally, um, a person with a disability can hear from the medical professional how they're broken, what's wrong with them. So they're not talking about it in context of what they can do um, and offering support. So it's very cold, kind of sterile as you might. But as counselors, we need to be encouragers too. And fortunately, a lot of people have done some heavy lifting in this area, and we have lots of examples. This is important information. Um, right now, I'd like to take look at a video we have. It's a really good one, and it's about a word called ableism. And I have a description here, but basically, you know, ableism looks at people with disabilities as inferior, and they're assumed to um, to have a deficit perspective. So I've been having a little bit of trouble playing the video, so I'm actually going to stop share, and then I'm going to share again um, on a different video screen here, but that'll kind of guarantee we can watch. So let's pick it up right here.
My name's Kaylee Rusin. I'm a psychology intern here at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. So I'm finishing my doctorate in clinical psychology, hoping to bridge into more clinical psychology with persons with disabilities. So disability is a very complex and broad term. And I do think that most of our training and exposure to disability as healthcare providers is through the medical model, which is understanding disability as some sort of physical or cognitive or sensory impairment or limitation in some ways. So the message is that a person with a disability is abnormal or limited. But there's a lot of different ways of looking at disability. So I'd like healthcare professionals to kind of be open to looking at other models of disability. So what are some of the value that we can see in disabled persons' lives, like from a cultural model or a social model of understanding that often the problem is not in the disabled person per se, but rather in a society that does not accommodate their different ways of moving throughout the world, of talking, of communicating, etc. It's so important for me because as a person with a disability, I've experienced this, and also within my field, I feel like psychology doesn't really do a good job of training therapists or other mental health professionals on how to talk about differences and disability in a way that is broader of scope. So if you only have one exposure to disability as through a medical model, reductionistic approach that the problem is within the person, then of course when you meet a person with disability, you're going to have a very limited understanding of their experience. You might feel bad for them, you might pity them in some ways. It might be really difficult for you to imagine being in their position, or difficult for you to imagine that they have a fulfilling quality of life, let's say, because of your own biases around that people should be independent, people should be productive, people should be dignified. Like there's all these ideas around what is a good quality of life, and having a medical model or understanding of disability really limits you to what is possible to have a good quality of life with a disability. So I think that disability has become one of those taboo topics for healthcare providers, where they interact with a person with a disability. They're trying to do everything right, and unintentionally they may be reinforcing biases that they might have because they're not willing to kind of explore that or talk about it, or they have the belief that they don't see disability or they don't see difference, that they treat everybody as individuals, that they're caring and empathetic, and I'm sure that they are. And a lot of times what happens is, because they're not willing to go there, or they're not willing to consider the disability, they may either overestimate the role of the disability in the person's life, meaning like wonder how they can get through their life with living with this disability, and putting themselves in their shoes and thinking like, oh man, if I was ever blind, I don't know how I'd get to work. That's really scary. No wonder this person is struggling and that they're depressed. Or on the other hand, totally ignoring it, not talking about it at all because they're afraid of offending, afraid of pointing out a difference, afraid of talking about something that maybe they don't feel like they have any expertise in. A lot of times when I go see a doctor, I'm sort of pushed around to other doctors because there's this opinion that you need to have a special expertise in disability in order to work with somebody with a disability, which I don't think is true. I think it's, if someone's coming to you for assistance with, let's say, mental health counseling, the disability definitely is going to play a role, but what role? And you can't know that until you talk about it, until you bring it up, and then take your cues from the client. If they say something like, actually, the fact that I'm depressed has to do with my relationship, like I don't feel my disability plays a role, that's fine, go with that. And maybe you'll find that it comes up in some other ways, or maybe it won't come up at all, but not addressing it and not talking about it, you can sort of put in these small little biases that might impact. So if you assume, for example, that a person with a disability is depressed because of their disability, then you might overlook a whole social aspect, or that they don't have a relationship, which is often a bias for persons with disabilities, that they're asexual, so then not asking about their sex life. That could be another example of how bias can come out and impact your treatment, but you weren't willing to look at it or talk about it, so then now it's had a negative impact.
Okay, great. So hopefully you were able to hear that. She kind of has a soft voice, but she said a lot. And what I really got out of that was um, she has aspiration. Clearly, she's working on her doctorate in psychology. People with disabilities are just like you and I. They have their own dreams and goals and should be encouraged to pursue them. Um, okay, next we have a case study. Okay, and once again, this would be a good place for you to hit the pause button and read the case of Jolene, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So go ahead and hit pause and come back when you're done. Okay, and this is another place to hit pause. I'd like you to pause it and take a look at these reflection and discussion questions, because we're going to talk a little bit about these um, things, but just take a look and see what you think, and then we'll do a case analysis. Okay, so here we go. Are you in your office ready to counsel and support Jolene? Let's take a look. The first thing to consider is the accessibility of your office. To start out with, Jolene is under no obligation to disclose her disability, and she has every right to expect accessibility. And again, thinking back to the Americans with Disability Act, she's protected by law. So areas to be assessed include things like the parking lot. Is there handicap parking, proximity to public transportation, entrance to the building, including any necessary ramps, automatic door openers, restrooms, or elevators, and having your own office already designed for someone with a disability to enter and exit comfortably without incident, embarrassment, or hopefully during the intake, you would discover if someone has a disability or an injury. And in this case, if the counselor knew that Jolene had a T12 spinal cord injury, it would have been helpful just to do a little homework on it. It's really not Jolene's responsibility to educate the therapist on spinal cord injuries, although she will be able to provide, specialized information regarding her specific situation as part of the ongoing process. The other thing to consider here is that in Jolene's case, her disability is the result of an accident. So she could be suffering PTSD. She may have received a traumatic brain injury that could be in play as well. And wheelchair users are also more susceptible to pneumonia, decubitus ulcers, and bladder infections than to be aware of. Thinking of abuse, as a woman with a significant disability, Jolene is susceptible to various sources of abuse. But they might take the form differently than what you think. So a disability specific form. And the spinal cord injury may make leaving an abusive situation even harder due to dependence on a daily physical assistance. So it might not be so easy to leave a bad situation because they're dependent on or even a system that is inherently abusive. Again, become familiar with the models of disability. We already talked about those. Assistive technology. So Jolene may have more last minute cancellations than non-disabled clients due to the unpredictability of technology and paratransit systems. So also therapists should not stare or avoid staring by not making eye contact, but instead see the person, not the wheelchair or any other type of assistive technology or equipment. So they have a lot more going on just in their regular lives, and some other people, counselors and therapists, we want to be sensitive and open-minded as to how that's going to impact their days. And again, in Jolene's case, she has multiple identities. So she's a female, she's an African American, and she's a person with a disability. And so that should be considered synergistic. She's likely to have a more difficult time gaining employment than men with a disability or even white women with disabilities. So it's crucial that we as therapists and counselors would support her in her goal to attend graduate college, critical to her goal of employment. And furthermore, persons with a disability who are employed are now more likely to marry, they're less likely to live below the poverty line and be institutionalized. We can see how important employment is so many aspects of living. Prioritizing goals. So even though depression may be presenting, and maybe you're thinking back to that video we just watched regarding this, it may or may not be due to her disability and should be approached as any depression would be. She may be experiencing daily microaggressions from people or even the built system around her that makes day-to-day living with a disability more challenging. And the effects of a spinal cord injury are all encompassing, affect every aspect of daily life. So setting concrete and specific goals is helpful. And, we haven't talked much about family of someone with a disability, but her family is also likely to be traumatized by her injury, dealing with strains on various types of resources. So family counseling may be an option to consider. A lot of people with the disability have a caretaker, and consider them as part of a counseling session at some point is probably a good idea. I thought this last part, putting it all together, disability affirmative therapy is a guide to help therapists conceptualize clients with disabilities, and it relies on a template of 8 client issues we're going to see here in a minute to understand, so that therapists can develop a case formulation. This is critical, that neither overemphasizes or underestimates the role of a disability. So you don't want to be all about the disability, but you don't want to ignore the disability. So from the following video, I have begin at 1 minute and you through 2 minutes and 4 seconds. And again, I'm going to stop sharing and just go to that video here. Yeah, here it is, right here.
I'm going to walk through 8 different areas that are the template of disability affirmative therapy. And the 8 areas are 8 considerations that the therapist might think about when thinking about any client who has a disability, including polio, post-polio. And the first area in there is developmental history. The second area is the client's model of disability. The third area is the interplay between disability and other client variables, such as ethnicity or gender or socioeconomic status, religion, or sexual orientation or age. The fourth area is disability culture and community. The fifth area is how disability affects social interactions. The sixth area is the cumulative effect of microaggressions. And if you're not familiar with that term, don't worry, I'll be defining it. And then seventh are the affective prescriptions and prohibitions. And then lastly, how disability affects areas of intimacy.
Okay, so those the 8 client issues, that's a great way to build that client case. So it takes into consideration the disability, but it's not the single issue. And that's important to do. Let's keep moving here. This is the post test. So hopefully by now, some of what we've talked about is clicking in. And let's take a look at some of these post test questions. The first one, that's going to be different for each person. What are your thoughts on persons with disabilities? What are your thoughts about providing counseling individuals with disabilities? I'm sure you're probably like me, in that you're open to it, you would want to do it. How do you believe religion plays a role in your view of individuals with disabilities? That's another big one for all of us to kind of answer. What do you believe the family experiences when another member has a disability? So there's a huge ripple effect. Someone in your family has a disability, it doesn't just affect that person. We all, we know how we feel when a loved one gets a cold or gets flu, maybe got COVID, right? So, and those things will go away, but a disability won't. And it's a lifelong thing. So definitely a family experience there. The next two are, I don't want to say they're questions, but are the ones that I did want to spend some time talking about. So what are your thoughts about the quality of life of an individual with a disability? In fact, some people may look at someone with a disability and say, oh, that poor person, they're to be pitied. That's not our job. And we heard in the video that no one wants to be thought of that way. So the quality of life is determined by each and every person with a disability or not. Our job is to help encourage and maybe point out resources and be a support in that journey, whatever quality of life anyone is aspiring to. Number 6, when should you ask a person about their disability? So this is probably the tricky one. I put that in there on purpose. You don't have to. You don't need to start out with that. Again, if someone wants to tell you about their disability, they will. But everything that I've researched says, you know what? A person is a person, and you would get to know a person with a disability just like you get to know anyone else you're meeting for the first time. And over time, if the person wants to talk about their disability, then they'll bring it up, and then that would be the appropriate. You shouldn't feel obligated to have to ask if you're wondering that. And of course, what legal rights, if any, do persons with disabilities have? By now, hopefully, you can say tons, thinking of the Disability Act. Okay, we're getting towards the end here. Empowerment. So we got 5 simple ways to empower a person with a disability, because that is part of our role as a counselor. And I'm not going to read these to you. If you like, you can pause on each slide and read all the fine bullet points, but I will read a small bit for each. But the first one we've already talked about, see the person first, not the disability. If you haven't spent time with someone with a disability, it might be an awkward experience for you at first. And if you're having a hard time, you're struggling with the interaction, just try to put yourself in their shoes and remember, how would you want to be? It's important to remember that people living with a disability are just like us. A person with a disability does not want to be defined by their abilities. So we've said this 3 or 4 times now, but they want to be seen as a person. Ask questions to learn about the person behind the disability, right? So again, if you're meeting someone for the first time, hey, what do you like to eat? What kind of movies do you like to watch? You reading any good books? What do you do in your spare time? Those are questions for anyone, whether they have a disability or not. Take the time to discover more about the person behind the disability. That goes back to what we learned in helping skills. That's just building rapport, that's earning trust. People will divulge things to you over time as they feel like they can trust you. And taking the time to learn about the person is going to help build that trust and create that environment of inclusiveness and unconditional positive regard that I know we always talk about. Number 3, listen to the person again behind the disability. When listening to a person with a disability, you can practice active listening techniques to let them know you are engaged in the conversation. Again, think back to our help. We're nodding along, giving verbal or nonverbal clues in our body language, leaning forward. We're making eye contact. Be a good listener also requires you to embrace your own emotional intelligence. So don't be afraid to ask them to elaborate, for clarification if required, and accept that we're all vulnerable, and that'll go a long way. A lot of information here, but encourage decision making to promote independence for people with disabilities. And it would be very easy to say, let me handle this for you, or here, I will do it. And while that might, on the surface, might seem like a genuine, kind gesture, this idea of promoting independence, those actions would actually be in the opposite direction. So whether decision is large or small, it's our responsibility to give the individual the right to make every decision about their lives. There's some bullet points, examples. Some decisions might be more difficult for them to make than others, which is why we can support people with disabilities before they put the decision in action. And again, example, while at times a person with a disability will seek your support, this doesn't mean that each decision they need to make will be difficult for them. Remain patient and let them know that you are there only if they need your direct support. And they would be the one to take the initiative and ask for that. And you can remind them that you're available, but that's, again, delicate balancing act there. And the 5th one, promote disability inclusivity. Building inclusive attitudes will directly combat and disrupt the stigma many people living with a disability still face. Changing community attitudes towards people with disabilities is one of the biggest obstacles we face as a society. So again, as counselors, we can have a role in this. We can help advocate for persons with disabilities and activity, and really starting with our own office and our own practice and our own attitudes. I wanted to share, in closing, I wanted to share this video. Maybe some of you know Joni Eareckson Tada. She's a quadriplegic. She's a Christian. She has her own ministry, Joni and Friends. She's been around for a long time. She's been a quadriplegic for over 52 years. And in terms of empowerment and I guess having the right attitude, man, she is a real inspiration. We've got a video here for you where she's celebrating the accident of her anniversary. So again, I'm going to stop share and then share again so we can get Joni on. Right. Okay.
Hi, I'm Joni, and I am shaking my head wondering, how did I get here? 52 years in a wheelchair is a long time. I mean, even Jesus thinks so. In John chapter 5, the Lord was at the pool of Bethesda, remember that? And he stopped by a man on a straw mat who had been paralyzed for 38 years. And it says, quote, when Jesus learned he had been in this condition for a long time. That's what it says in verse 6. And when I read those words, a long time, I mean, tears filled my eyes. Because, man, if Jesus thinks that 38 years of paralysis is a long time, what's he think of 52 years? Yeah, I think he probably says it's a long time. And so do I. And yes, every day I'm wasting away. You've heard about the recurring cancer and those new problems with my lungs and pain, and our bodies are just fragile. But I am still on the growing side, the strong side. Because like the Bible says, I'm growing in two directions at the same time. Outwardly, I'm wasting away. But inwardly, man, I'm being renewed day by day. My body may be unraveling, but my spirit, my measure of faith and my assurance of salvation, my sensitivity to sin, my confidence in the Word of God, my hope of heaven, compassion for others with disabilities, my love of Jesus, everything about my spirit is growing. Sure, I'm weaker physically, but I grow stronger spiritually. Deep, great trials bring with them deep grace from God, all of which enlarges our soul's capacity for Jesus. And that's what I'm celebrating on my accident anniversary. So join me in the celebration. Help me here at Joni and Friends, would you? Share this wonderful message of being renewed in Christ day by day. Help me share with many more people with disabilities all around the world. God bless you for listening and caring and being a part of Joni and Friends.
When it comes to having the right attitude, I don't know how she remains so positive. Well, I mean, I do know, but I would think that would be something that all of us would, I guess, in one way or another, aspire to if we found ourselves at. Definitely an encouragement and a real example of how to move forward with a quadriplegia and a disability. Okay, trying to minute here. Oh, why they didn't want. For this. Okay, that was Joni and Friends, and references and resources. So here are, of course, all the references, and then 3 resources local ones that I found. Disability Rights in Ohio, Sandusky County Board of Developmental Disabilities is where I live, and then Pathway organization up in Toledo for senior citizens with disabilities. The 3 area resources if anyone's interested or would like information. Everybody, at this point, this concludes my presentation. I do hope you learned something. Thanks for putting up with some of the technical difficulties. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me by email or on the bulletin board or whatever. I'll be happy to answer your questions, and I appreciate this time with you.